It was a public holiday in South Korea. The local elections were the first in 30 years, and it played a significant role in the country's democratization process, making it a large event with more than 13 million people participating in the elections. Most people were at home, watching it on their television, but if you were to ask anyone back in 1991 in South Korea what happened on this day, nobody would remember the elections. Whilst everyone was so focused on the local elections, a horrific tragedy in Daeju took place. This tragedy would spread like wildfire, eventually becoming the biggest missing persons case in South Korea. On the day of the elections, 5 friends from Daeju, aged 9 to 13, set out to catch frogs and salamander eggs on Mount Waryeon, a local mountain which was only a few kilometers away from their homes. As time passed and the parents patiently waited for their sons to arrive home, all 5 parents grew concerned as by the afternoon they still hadn't heard from their children. What made things more concerning for the parents was that they knew it was unlike their sons to stay out all day. They were known to be well behaved, so when the parents hadn't heard anything from their sons, they immediately knew something was wrong. Back in 1991, cell phones were not widely available, and none of their children had phones, so with no way of getting a hold of their kids, the parents went out to look for their children in the local village, but nothing. They checked all the usual spots they'd hang around, but they were nowhere to be seen. The parents immediately informed the police of their 5 missing sons, and initially the dispatcher sent out a few local policemen to help search for the kids, but for the most part the police believed that the kids likely lost track of time or were runaways. Over the years, as the case unfolded, it was clear that this case was anything but a runaway case. The Frog Boys were a group of 6 friends aged 9 to 13. Kim Young-sik, Park Chan-in, Kim Tae-young, Kim Young-gu, Jo Ho-young and Woo Cheo-won. Though the group weren't related, the parents described the group to be closer than brothers. They called them the 5 Musketeers. All throughout their youth they'd go out and explore the local area. This day seemed no different. At around 9 PM on the day of the elections, they each left their homes and met up in the local area. They lived close together in a circular-shaped area where they often hung out. As Woo, one of the Frog Boys, left his house, his father would ask him where he and his friends planned on going. Woo replied with, "I'm just going to play outside." This would be the last thing Woo would say to his father before wandering off into the distance. By the looks of it, the group had gone on a spontaneous adventure, not knowing their exact destination, though some of the boys did have gear for catching small animals like a bucket, backpack and a net. They started the day in town and eventually took a path up behind this high school. There laid Mount Waryeong, a local mountain peak only a couple of kilometers out of town which the boys were still familiar with. The mountain was known for its spring bloom and luscious nature, and it stems from the fresh water. As they were going out of town, a local student bumped into the group and asked them where they were heading. They replied saying, "We're going to find salamander eggs, a type of amphibian similar to frogs which was commonly found in the streams of Mount Waryeong." The case was initially named Salamander Boys, but I'm not entirely sure why. The case later became known as the Frog Boys. Nevertheless, the group continued on their adventure and explored deeper into Mount Waryeong. As they went deeper, 10-year-old Kim Tae-young had a dispute with the rest of the group. His parents had previously told him not to explore too far, so he decided to stop halfway through the journey and returned home. He was the only one to return home that day. The other 5 boys continued on their adventure and followed the stream looking for salamander eggs. The area was isolated, there was nothing more than a stream of water and trees surrounding the area. Though, in the vicinity of Mount Waryeong was a secret military base, as well as a nearby shooting range. Warning signs were around the shooting range, making it known it was a clear danger zone. There are also theories surrounding this topic, but I'll discuss that further in the video. What we do know is that the Frog Boys' last location was somewhere in Mount Warryong, and whatever happened there remains a mystery to this day. Shortly after 1 PM, Woo's father received a phone call from the Taekwondo Academy regarding his son's absence for his 1 PM class. Woo's father was the first to search the local villages and the usual places the Frog Boys would play, but of course, they were nowhere to be seen. One by one, the other parents began to ask themselves the same question: where were their sons? As we already know, the Frog Boys were well-behaved kids and were very familiar with the area. So as the afternoon went by with still no sign of the Frog Boys anywhere, the parents decided to take matters into their own hands. With the help of Kim Tae-rong and the local student who had seen the Frog Boys walking up Mount Warryong, the parents would enter Mount Warryong searching for the Frog Boys. At the beginning, it wasn't very important news. The pro-democracy movement was growing in Korea, and everybody's attention was focused on who'd be elected. As they went out to search for their sons, the parents informed the police of their 5 missing children in Daeju. Unfortunately, the urgency of the situation was not immediately fully recognised. The police took the report lightly and suggested their sons had lost track of time or they were runaways. Given that the boys were known to be well behaved, this must have been devastating for the parents to hear, as the first crucial hours of any investigation are often the most important. Although the dispatcher did send a few local authorities to Mount Warryong to help the parents search for their kids, but as it got darker and more difficult to see, the parents and police would return home empty-handed. The reality of losing their sons really began to sink in for each parent. They blamed one another for not being more vigilant about where their children were that day. 2 days had passed. The elections had begun to quieten down, and the news of the 5 missing boys quickly spread across Daeju. By the end of the week, the incident became nationwide news, sparking debate whether or not the boys were even alive. It was only after the media coverage intensified, the South Korean police began to take the case more seriously, ramping up search operations and spending more time and resources in finding the missing boys. As the case grew more popular, this led to more than 500 leads to come through. Whilst some were helpful and resourceful, few were evil. 3 days after the disappearance, the parents of Kim Jong-suk received a call from an unknown individual who had claimed to have the missing children. "I have the children. They are suffering. 2 of them are very ill." The anonymous caller demanded ransom money in exchange for their safe return. The caller said to meet near Daeju police station at a specific date and time. Police and families waited for more than an hour, but no sign of the Frog Boys ever appeared. We don't know for sure if this mysterious caller was scared of getting caught with all the police and attention surrounding the police station, but police deemed the caller a hoax, and that it was all a twisted prank, causing false hope for the families of the Frog Boys. The search for their sons and the long wait for answers took a significant emotional toll on the families, especially the fathers. Shortly after the hoax, the fathers quit their jobs to carry out relentless searches and protests all over South Korea. Throughout March and April, police, volunteers and local residents conducted extensive searches around the area, but still found no leads or evidence of the missing boys. On May 4th, 1991, the parents participated in a news programme called The Square of Public Opinions. They protested that the police pamphlets were downplaying the ordeal, labelling the children as runaways and not missing. It was obvious that the police were trying to make it seem like a runaway case, but why? Why was the police downplaying the seriousness of 5 missing children? Whilst on this news programme, the parents insisted that rather sharing any useful information to the police, they would send it over to them directly through the news programme. One call in particular went through live on air. The caller claimed to be 10-year-old Kim Jong-suk, one of the missing frog boys. His mother confirmed that the voice was indeed her son's, relieving an unimaginable burden off the parents' shoulders. But for those who are watching the news at home would know the call was suddenly cut short. The news workers managing the communications try calling the number again but fail to get a hold of the caller, leading them to trace the number and realising it was just another hoax. The parents were devastated. The live news sparked nationwide attention, causing the public to grow more frustrated at the lack of investigative efforts. The police suddenly continued to take the case more seriously due to the increased pressure and growing frustration of the public. Over the following summer, thousands of volunteers and policemen searched the area. The search area covered a large radius around Mount Warryong, including rivers, forests, and abandoned buildings. Eventually, the case becomes so large it gets the attention of the South Korean president, Roh Tae-woo. In 1991, it was reported President Tae-woo dispatched a police force of 300,000 officers to search for the missing boys. This made it the largest missing persons investigation in South Korea. But there was some criticism in the investigative efforts from the officers themselves. Some people believed they were out there just for the sake of publicity. The investigation continued for the next 11 years with the use of helicopters, divers, and sniffer dogs, but not a single trace of evidence was ever found. In 1996, Kim Gun-won, a South Korean psychologist from the US, travelled to Daegu. Ga-won took a deep interest in the Frog Boys case and had analysed it for years. He made a grave accusation, saying that Jun-sik's father had been the person behind the boy's disappearance. This shocked the nation. Jun-sik's father, who had tirelessly travelled across the country to raise awareness about his son's disappearance, adamantly denied any involvement. Ga-won claimed that Kim had buried the children under his home. His suspicion stemmed from the fact that Kim couldn't recall where he was during the critical 3 hours following the boy's disappearance. This gap in Kim's memory raised the red flags for the psychologist, leading him to suggest Kim's involvement in the crime. The community was divided, with some people considering the possibility, while others stood by the grieving father, believing he was innocent. Though it was a serious accusation with little evidence, the police proceeded to dig up Kim's home whilst the media filmed the entire situation. The humiliation the psychologist faced after it was revealed that nothing was beneath Kim's home was immense, further deepening the pain for Jun-sik's already grieving family. With an audience watching, they became angry at the psychologist, which led to him running away from a crowd screaming, "Catch him, catch him." The thought of ever finding the Frog Boys became a distant dream. The case grew cold, with leads drying up and hope fading for the families. The fathers had to quit their search and went back to work to support their ongoing responsibilities at home. Public interest lessened as each year went by, but on the afternoon of September 26, 2002, everything would change. On this day, 2 local residents were exploring Mount Warryong looking for acorns, when all of a sudden they stumbled across small pieces of clothing. They were confused at first, and thought it was probably an old piece of clothing which was left and forgotten about. But as they investigated closer, they began to discover small human bones. The authorities were alerted and arrived at the scene shortly after. Upon arrival, the police called the forensics team to handle the evidence. Whilst the forensics team were on their way, the police decided to dig up the remaining evidence themselves, tampering with it despite it being the forensics team's job. The police handled the bones carelessly, simply piling them on top of each other without any regard for proper procedure. But as they were looking into the clothes, they began to realise something. A few of the clothes had sleeves tied together. It was done in a way where it would be impossible to tie yourself, meaning someone else had to have done it. Family members of the Frog Boys managed to identify personal items and clothes confirming that they belonged to their children. As they investigated further, several unused bullets were found inside the clothing of some of the children. All of a sudden, this case was no longer a missing persons case. This was a homicide case. One of the skulls had a parallel hole entering and exiting. The holes found in the skull led forensics to later find that 3 of the skulls had blunt force trauma. This led them to suggest that a blunt object caused the damage. Despite the mounting evidence prompting a homicide case, the police thought otherwise. When police saw the bones of the boys, they described them as intertwined and seemed to have huddled together. They thought the boys must have died from the cold. But this wouldn't make sense for multiple reasons. The boys were only 2 kilometers away from their homes and could have used the light from the nearby traffic in order to find their way back. Secondly, passing away from a natural cause would not explain why their clothes were tied together or why there was blunt force trauma on 3 skulls. The families refused to believe the boys froze to death and fought to keep the case from being closed so quickly. While some argued that the police and the investigation team severely mismanaged the discovery, damaging evidence and claiming the holes were accidental. What made this discovery so strange was that the area had already been covered and searched over 500 times. So many questioned how the bones suddenly appeared 11 years later. Did searchers happen to miss it? Perhaps an inexperienced police officer failed to recognise a freshly buried patch on the ground during the initial search. What we do know is, despite the resources and extensive search efforts, it took far too long to find the missing boys. For the Frog Boys case, finding a motive was near impossible. They were well-behaved and innocent children, so finding out why or who would do this was already difficult. In murder cases, there's usually a motive, but there simply isn't any in this case. As we know, there was a shooting range that was not far from where the boys were discovered. On the day the boys went missing, there were reports that someone at the shooting range had emptied the remaining ammo from his gun. To this day, the identity of this individual remains unknown. One of the guns that the military used was an M16, which was capable of shooting very far as well as within the range between the base and where the boys were found. The theory goes that a soldier had accidentally shot one of the boys. However, an accidental shooting from a soldier seems highly unlikely. One of the boys, found with 2 holes on either side of his head, showed no signs consistent with a gunshot wound or bone fractures. There were also no bloodstains on the boys' clothes, which would typically indicate an attack. This also doesn't explain why the boys were found with their clothing tied into knots that they weren't able to do themselves. This would lead the theory to suggest that the rest of the boys were killed by the military to cover up the accidental shooting. Forensic experts confirmed they believed this was a homicide and that they were buried and killed in the same spot. Despite the military's suspicious behaviour, the police never questioned them, leaving this theory uninvestigated. This case is unlike any other I've covered. 5 young boys, some of them not even in their teens, disappear out of nowhere, and 11 years later they are found with the most bizarre evidence of murder. Everything just seemed to be pointing towards murder, and yet there's just no concrete evidence to prove it. The parents finally decided to lay their children to rest on March 26, 2004, exactly 13 years after they had disappeared. Their ashes were scattered in a nearby river. In an attempt to gain justice and continue the fight for their children, a lawsuit was filed against the police, which ended up going to 3 trials. All unfortunately, the judge sided with the police. The families and the public all suspect that the military have some sort of involvement, but without any new information, this case will leave us wondering, what happened to the Frog Boys?